Okay, we are now recording the call. Today is May 22nd, 2015, and we are on a Taos Institute webinar, a dialogue with Frank Barrett, who will be talking about his book, Yes to the Mess, Surprising Leadership Lessons from Jazz. This has been part of a 3-week-long online dialogue series around this book that we have done on our Taos Institute online learning community, and we invite all of you to continue this conversation online after the webinar today. And you will see on the slide, the link at the bottom of the slide that you're viewing has the taoslearning.ning.com website link, and we can all go there and continue this conversation. Right now, I would like to introduce Frank, who is a Taos Institute associate. He has been for many years. And Frank is Professor of Management and Global Public Policy at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. He holds a PhD in Organizational Behavior from Case Western Reserve University and is an accomplished jazz musician. In addition to leading his own trios and quartets, Frank has traveled extensively with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. His research interests and expertise include organizational change, social constructionism, organizational innovation, improvisation, and appreciative inquiry. And we are so thrilled that you're with us today, Frank. And I invite you to kind of start us off, and we'll take questions as we go through the talk. I will keep track of the question window, and I will be asking Frank the questions that are coming in, and we can continue on with that. Thank you so much, Frank. I'm going to hand the microphone over to you, and I'm going to turn off my my video.
So just to be clear, right now you're looking at the Taos Institute slide. So if I shift over to this other one, will you just verify that we're all looking at the same slide, Dawn?
Yep. Great.
Okay, wait a second. Clicky, oh no, I don't want to lose, okay. It's just a little tricky. I'm trying to change, I'm having trouble getting my slide up here for some reason. Okay, let's see if this one works. Okay, how's that? Can you see my?
Perfect, we can see your slides.
Okay, and so you'd be looking at slides, not me, correct?
We can see both your slide and you. Okay,
good. Okay, thank you, and thanks everybody for joining in the last 3 weeks, particularly the online discussion has been very rich, and I want to thank those who've taken time to pose questions and their experiences. It was thought-provoking for me. I several times stopped and had to think and wrote a few long responses, and that was good, insightful for me, so thank you for those who shared with that. I thought I would just take maybe 15 or 20 minutes and just do a quick summary of the ideas in the book in case some people have not read it, and then we can start an ongoing discussion and see where it goes. So what interests me about this particular topic, first of all, it was somewhat accidental that I came into this because I've been a jazz musician before I went to graduate school, and I'd already was writing my dissertation. And Carl Weick, I met Carl Weick at a conference, and Suresh Srivastava, my dissertation advisor, introduced me to him as that former jazz musician. And Carl said to me, are you writing your dissertation on jazz bands? And I was puzzled because I thought, what do these two things have to do with each other? I'm writing about groups and teams, and why would I write about jazz? And then suddenly it hit me over the head that jazz bands are also groups and teams engaged in dialogue, and it just opened a whole world for me. It's funny, you never know where lightning's going to strike. The most naive question opens up whole worlds, and it wasn't a naive question, it was a very wise question. And so I started to notice the dynamics when a jazz band, especially when I was playing on weekends, what was going on and how it was different from the groups I was meeting with when I was going through my, and facilitating when I was going through my doctoral program at Case, and then came out here to the Naval Postgraduate School. So what interests me in this theme is how can we nurture environments for mutual learning and support and bring out the best in each other, because jazz bands are pretty good at that. At least that's what they aim to do. I think a couple of things I want to set this up, and one of the themes in the book is that I think we have an unfortunate way to talk about creativity and an unfortunate way we talk about leadership. They're misleading narratives. We talk about creativity as if it's an individual gift, as creative geniuses are born, or even as if creative genius is made, as if it's an individual achievement. And the same thing with leadership. We talk about individual leaders as if they're these terrifically gifted people. Just look at the way we talk about Steve Jobs now, and you know, and used to be Bill Gates, or it used to be Jack Welch. I think when we miss a lot when we glorify the individuals. In fact, creativity is a joint achievement. It's almost always a relational achievement. And even if you looked at, you know, the great Thomas Edison, who was hailed as the genius of the 20th century for all his discoveries, really what he was doing was facilitating a good jazz band. He was putting together these really interested, exciting, excitable young tinkerers and putting them together in New Jersey. And they were probing and wondering and listening and experimenting and learning as a group. And all of the inventions for which he was credited were really social achievements and the result of lots of experiments and mistakes and trying again and again. And that's exactly what jazz bands do. And if you think, even of what the role of an executive in today's fast-changing world, high-velocity environment, what goes on with executives and jazz musicians is really similar. I mean, if you think about this description, that you are in public, you have to take action in a high-velocity environment. There's no way to predict whether or not your actions will lead to success or not. And there are several inputs, and it's equivocal because there's several different ways you could interpret the messages that are being thrown at you, with no guarantee that whatever action you take will be successful. However, you do need to act, and it's in public, so you can't take it back. And you're in a group where everybody's in the same, facing the same challenges. That's what jazz musicians do, and it's also what executives do in this fast-changing world of social media. So what can we learn from jazz bands? And I think these are the questions that really interest me, because what jazz bands do is, you know, usually we think that learning is something you do first and then you execute. You get all your mistakes out of the way, you learn, you master something, and then you go out and execute it. But in fact, isn't it possible to be performing and learning simultaneously? We don't usually talk about those things as simultaneous acts. Well, jazz bands do. They're experimenting and learning simultaneously and trying to achieve a reliable performance while they're in the midst of experimentation in the face of the unknown. So how can we create conditions that can maximize this learning by doing? Because I think there's some lessons we could apply. And I think if we looked real closely, this is happening in non-jazz contexts. In the book, I use several examples of organizations that are doing some version of this. And we had a great discussion over the last 3 weeks online. And if you think about it as well, the other reason I think jazz is an interesting metaphor for our lives is think about how many quote-unquote leaderless, non-hierarchical movements or organizations are are coming to birth now. You know, Wikipedia is really a collective improvisation with no authoritative leader making decisions. It's not a command and control system. You think about Occupy Wall Street or the Arab Spring, this sort of spontaneous growth of organizations where leadership is distributed. And there are now increasingly organizations where this is happening too, and I could say more about that in a moment. But I think it means we're moving away from this image of organizations as bureaucracies to something flatter, more participative. At the same time, I think we're moving away from this notion of leaders as great men and looking more towards collective efficacy. I think of, for example, the great work done by Boris Groysberg from Harvard Business School. He was looking at Wall Street investment analysts, and he noticed how some of the investment firms were trying to raid and get the superstar performers. So they would go in, they find the highest performing person in an investment firm and hire them into their firm. And suddenly their performance wasn't nearly as good. And he came to the conclusion that data shows that really that performance was in fact a cultural social achievement. And you know, it put the individual in a new context, and suddenly everything changes, which means maybe you should look at context and relationships to start with. So this notion of distributed leadership, complex shared participation where leading is pushed, and there's, you know, you can mobilize initiative throughout a system and engage in wider participation. That's what jazz bands do, and we see more and more of that I think in organizations now. Well, let's see. The other thing I want to talk about is the actual experience of improvisation. When we're improvising, what's happening? And I think speaks to the question of identity a bit, because in order to be in a state of improvisation, it's a state of openness, of receptivity, of an attunement to what unfolds. Sometimes people welcome predictability and stability at our own risk because we give up something. And improvisation, to stay in a state of improvisation, is an invitation to ongoing growth and development. In a way, it's you know, it's in a way it's a spiritual state to be. If you look at some of the great spiritual leaders, they talk about you know, this state of openness and attunement to what's unfolding. But in day-to-day life, we tend to get blocked in that a lot. And what blocks us often is shame. This notion of am I going to get it right? Or my ideas aren't good enough. So a lot of things block us from that, from initiative and whatnot. So the question I've been asking myself lately, is it possible to live at the edge of our identities where we're experimenting beyond routine and predictability? And that's what jazz musicians are doing all the time. If you look real closely at the way jazz players talk about their activity and what they do, they certainly are not drawn to it because of the money. It's or career standing, because it's not a financially rewarding life. It's something else, and I think this is it. This notion of ongoing growth of identity and ongoing a life of discovery. So I'm going to go through quickly each of the chapters of the book, and just in case, I assume not everyone's read it, and I'll highlight each chapter, and then as we talk in the dialogue, we might want to drill down into some of the points. See, the first point is this notion of mastering the art of unlearning. Jazz musicians begin by unlearning their own habits. So you build up these routines, and you build up this kind of expertise, but the notion is that you shouldn't sound too much like yourself. You shouldn't be playing the same things you've been playing over and over again. If you sound predictable, you're considered a bad jazz improviser. So the notion is to try and overcome this success trap, and I love the phrase competency trap or success trap, to get better and better at doing the wrong thing because it's been successful in the past. And in so many organizations, this happens, where we, the auto industry in the 1960s and even again in the early 2000s fell into a competency trap. The notion is what jazz musicians do is try to deliberately create opportunities to surprise themselves. So they develop these routines but then abandon them to the point where you get suspicious of your own patterns and sort of throw yourself into the terror because there's no guarantee that what you're going to try is going to work. So there is an edge of terror, there's an edge of fear to jazz improvisation. And some of the greatest jazz performances are right on the edge of falling apart into total chaos. So the notion is, I love this quote from Miles Davis. He said, "If it sounds clean and slick, I've been doing it too long." And Oscar Peterson, who was for a long time one of my favorite jazz pianists, is regarded not as a great improviser because he sounded the same. His solos were fairly planned and predictable, although they were great, so I shouldn't criticize him. But Sonny Rollins, on the other hand, is considered one of the greatest living improvisers. He's still alive. I think he's about 84, 85 years old now. Because he's always trying something he's never done before. The question is, what leads to routines, and why do routines become so seductive? I think part of the reason is we live at such high velocity, we love security, we love predictability. So in organizations, we need freedom to break away from success traps. And it takes a little bit of a detachment and also a different kind of attachment, sort of a welcoming to newness, to novelty, and to notice offers, to notice that there's plenty of offers and invitations in the world to branch off and embellish, and to have sort of a more open view of the future. And some of the greatest jazz players, Keith Jarrett, the great pianist, this happened to him as well. He realized at some point he was sounding just like Keith Jarrett, and he didn't like that anymore. So he said he noticed his hands were going on their own, doing their own thing. So he deliberately broke out of his formulas. So great organizations, great leaders know how to do this too. If you're going to give up the past, if you're going to give up this notion of past success and reliability, what makes jazz work is this notion of yes to the mess, this affirmative mindset, the belief that whatever has happened has positive potential. If I pay close enough attention to what's going on and just leap in, it'll go in a positive direction. And I say appreciative mindset because problem solving isn't going to help here too much. You can't stop and say, I don't like what we did. Let's go back over the last two measures. What's needed is this affirmative mindset, this notion of something positive can emerge. And I know several of us are appreciative inquiry believers. So this is right in the same category as appreciative inquiry. It's sort of this openness to the immediacy of wonderment. And the notion is there's a risk, of course, but risk is an inherent part of learning. It's an intrinsic part of learning. And any real learning that happens has some risk attached to it. And I think, and by the way, let me say one more thing about this before I go on. It's a full-bodied immersion. It's not just your mind making an affirmative move. It's, your entire body is engaged in activity when you say yes to the mess. In that sense, it's a very pragmatic view of learning. And where means and ends and context all come together. If you look at photos of jazz musicians, by the way, they're totally engaged in their task. And I said earlier, what keeps us locked in routine often is a sense of shame, the sense of not wanting to make a mistake or worrying that we'll be seen as incompetent somehow. So jazz musicians are always in dialogue with this voice of shame. And shame drives out improvisation. You can't feel shameful and also improvise. Those two things don't go together. So the next notion is this notion of minimal consensus and minimal structures that allow maximal autonomy. There is a structure to jazz, but it's minimal and it's marked through time. So it's chord changes of a song, but it allows everybody to embellish. You know the general orientation of each person throughout the song, but you have no way to predict what's going to happen. And again, think about applying that to organizations. If we just had just enough consensus, total consensus is as damaging as no consensus. You don't want complete agreement. You want just enough agreement on just the right things, just enough rules. And again, it's not that there's no rules, there has to be coordination, but just enough to allow people to take off in wherever they need to go, and so you can respond in the moment, and giving people freedom to experiment and respond to hunches, and not have to resolve every difference or disagreement. So it'd be a tolerating dissent, debate, as long as the core principles are held up. And I give several examples in the book of organizations that do this. I work for the U.S. Navy, so they tend to over-rely on structure. They tend to drive out innovation in that sense, although there's pockets even within the Navy where we see valuing of minimal structure that allows innovation and responsiveness. If you're going to ask people to say yes to the mass and experiment in an ongoing way, you can be sure there's going to be mistakes. So chapter 4 deals with errors as a source of learning and openness to new possibilities and discovery. So when jazz musicians make mistakes, it's an invitation to incorporate them into the ongoing flow of ideas. It means that we have to forgive each other for noble efforts. So, some mistakes are intolerable, and mistakes of carelessness are totally intolerable. But so it's not a mistake of carelessness, but a mistake of effort, of noble effort, needs to be forgiven, so that people don't become too careful. Be careful about the right things, but being too careful not to make a mistake will drive out improvisation, creativity, and innovation. There's several examples of how mistakes in the world have led to great discoveries. Penicillin, for example, but several other examples. And organizations, a lot of surprising examples of organizations that do this. I remember once I was doing this presentation at Boeing Airlines, and the manager of safety said, well, gosh, when we have a failure, we try and recreate the failure so we can learn everything we can about the whole system. And we basically repeat the failure. And of course, their goal is to drive out all failure, and we don't want them improvising with various ways to land airplanes, especially if we're on the plane. But that notion of learning as much as you can about what surrounds the mistake by repeating it, that's exactly what jazz players do. Mistakes happen all the time, but you repeat them as another group of notes. I love this quote from Michael Jordan. He said, "I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my life. I've lost almost 300 games." And he says, "I've failed over and over again. This is why I succeed." It's a paradoxical statement, but it's a good one. So I write extensively about mistakes in chapter 4. Chapter 5 is about this notion of space for serendipity. I call it, creating an architecture for serendipity, creating space where happy accidents can happen, accidental discoveries, random encounters. In jazz, we have jam sessions where You don't know what's going to happen, but you just hang out and play. And even afterwards, hang out and talk in coffee shops or bars, where you just go debrief what happened and explore. This is basically what Thomas and Edison did in his Menlo Park lab. That's why he had so many great inventions came from him, from his group. It's a place where naive questions are legitimate. It's where outsiders learn what it takes to be an insider. How do people behave like that? It's an informal learning space that celebrates incidents. And by the way, I said something about Steve Jobs earlier. I'll say something positive about him now. That he really got this when he designed the Pixar building. And I'm talking about this in chapter 5. Designed it deliberately so these introverted engineers would have to talk to each other. Created public space where people had to speak with each other. So hanging out and talking among, with no agenda and creating space for that is really important. And organizations would do well to take that seriously and get better at that. Chapter 6, alternating between soloing and supporting, is actually becoming my favorite chapter. This notion that followership can be a noble calling. We usually talk about, we have all this literature on leadership, but not much on followership. And I think that we don't have models of what good followership looks like. And jazz does. We call it comping, short for accompany. This notion that your whole mission in life is to make the soloist even more brilliant, but to do so without your ego on display. So your whole purpose is to make that soloist star, to make him shine, or her. There's more and more jazz musicians, women jazz musicians, I'm happy to say, to make him or her the soloist star. So you take turns, and you have to be good at creating this holding environment that supports others unfolding their ideas in real time. So you give each other room to experiment, to develop themes, to listen really well. And I call it generous listening. There's all this literature on active listening, where active listening means you're able to repeat back exactly what you heard. This isn't exactly it. It's not just that. Generous listening means you not only are listening closely, but you're creating space. It might mean you're provoking occasionally. It might mean you're sort of pushing the soloist in certain directions because you can see possibilities, but it also means you're laying out and creating lots of space. So it's, I like that notion of followership as a noble calling, because we usually think, if you're not a leader, you're a failure. And I think we all know people like that. I remember there was a woman when I was in graduate school at Case. There was this woman who looked on the surface like she wasn't that bright. She was not remarkable in her writing or her speaking, but someone noticed. Someone finally one time said, "Did you ever notice when," I'll make up a name, Alice, I'll call her Alice. Alice doesn't say much, but when she's in the room, everybody is smarter. And it was really true. It seemed like people got more articulate when she was in the room. And so after that person said that, I started to notice. And what she was doing was asking questions. She would just ask questions and really listen. And sure enough, people around her became more articulate. That's a great example of comping. And it turns out she's very, very smart, by the way. I call this notion provocative competence, chapter 7. And that is the book I'm working on now. Leadership is provocative competence. This notion of, a great leader, a great teacher is able to sort of explore the competency level of a group or a person and disrupt routines just enough to demand that people sort of show up in new ways or create new possibilities. So this disruption, this dislodging of habit that demands that people pay attention to what unfolds and contribute in ways that enhance their potential rather than repeat their past success. And my example of this, of course, is Miles Davis, although there's several examples in jazz. Duke Ellington's another one. And you know, he was brilliant at dislodging automaticity or habit and demanding his musicians try something brand new. And it's called back to my first point when I started, that demand that people discover their identity as they go, and become open and attuned to what's unfolding rather than simply repeating what they've done in the past. And the goal of all jazz is striking a groove, hitting this groove where you reach this sort of dynamic synchronization where you're sort of in a state of flow. That I talk about that throughout the book. It's not a separate chapter. Well, I went longer than I thought. I apologize for that. I want to make room for questions. So, Dawn, are you there?
Hi, Frank. Yes, I'm here, and we do have a question that's come in. If there's other questions coming in, I will let Frank know. The question is from Cynthia, and she says, I would imagine that the third principle on minimal consensus and minimal structures requires team members to have some level of mastery in their trade. I know that jazz musicians practice on their own before they come together. What do you have to say about this, the need for mastery and the cultivation of it?
Yes, there is truth in that. There's a base level of competence that allows this to work. However, what worries me when we say that, because I know that this comes up regularly, is that there's this notion, well, if you're an expert, you can then improvise, and it doesn't apply to the rest of us. But you know, part of yes to the mess means whatever group you're in front of, or whatever person is on your team, you say yes to that possibility. So what I like about the Japanese have this saying. I remember when I was studying this school where they were teaching these 4, 5, 6-year-old kids to play violin or piano, and I was thinking, how is it possible they can teach kids to play like this? And one of the Japanese teachers, the Suzuki teacher, said, well, it's because every human being is a genius. And, you know, I immediately thought of some I would not put in that category, but it made me think for a moment. I said, well, why did you say that? She said, because everybody learns to speak a language. And when you learn a language, you're capable of novelty and openness, and it's endless. And it occurred to me that's so insightful, that when people come together, that we're all experts in a way, because we have language, we're able to speak, we're able to have dialogue, and so there's a base level of expertise of every human person, every adult human person, and so the trick is when groups come together, teams come together, they have a lot more expertise than we know often, and you know what. And by the way, and in jazz bands, there's a more variety in terms of talent than you might know. So one of the funny things that happens in jazz bands is you often come together and you've never played together. That happens a lot. That happens for all of us. And one of the first things you have to do is find a common denominator, with a language that everybody can speak and do well. So there's, you know, if you get together with a great jazz musician, and there's a lot of experience, and somebody who's only been playing a couple of years, one of the first things they do is decide, well, what song should we play in what key, and they have to find a common language right away, and it's often at the level of the person with the least amount of experience gets to call the song, and then plays with people who are much better than him, but then he becomes much better. And all of a sudden, everybody is. So once they find this sort of common denominator of expertise, and it means that for real advanced experts, this is low, and yet everybody can thrive. There's an art to that. So, but your point is well taken. It's true.
Okay, Frank, great. Thank you. We've got a couple more questions coming in. Bruce asks, I'd like to know if Frank has applied these principles to conflict resolution work such as mediation or negotiation, and maybe you have an example of that.
It's when I did my sabbatical at Harvard Business School, I was part of the negotiation project. And in fact, this has taken off in negotiations. Let me just cut to the quick and recommend a book that really deals with this. It's by Mike Wheeler, Wheeler, and he writes about negotiation as improvisation. The improvisation people have just taken off with this whole notion of, because every negotiation is an improvisation. Once you enter a negotiation, you're entering into the unknown, and yet you're interacting in dialogue. And there's several examples. And by the way, at least at the Harvard program in negotiation, the way that they do most of their teaching is essentially to set up small improvisation games. They do negotiation games or role plays and simulations where they give you sort of a running start, or a little script that's become sort of like a minimal structure, and says, okay, now you guys talk to each other and see what evolves. And so they use lots and lots of they use the metaphor of improvisation all the time, because, and by the way, some of you might have seen the Ken Burns special on jazz improvisation. There's one of the things that caught my ear immediately. Wynton Marsalis defines jazz, and here's what he says. He says, jazz improvisation is a negotiation. So it's basically a democracy of negotiation, and so it's the language between both, and they bleed into each other very easily. If you're interested in more of this, the other person, James Sabinas, Sebenius at Harvard Business School, has done is doing a look at the great negotiators, and he looks at, I'm trying to remember his name. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. He looks at the guy who negotiated the agreement with in Afghanistan right after 9/11. Brahimi, Brahimi, and he talks about Brahimi's mastery of improvisation. And there's a video somewhere, I don't know how to get it at the moment, of Brahimi talking about what he did when he was in Afghanistan trying to negotiate a settlement. And it sounds just like a jazz musician talking about what they do. So.
Okay, we've got another question that, let's see, let me get back up to it. Sometimes the hardest part is finding your personal genius. So it kind of goes back to what we were saying a little bit ago. Any advice on how to, look for the personal genius or find it?
Yeah, it sure is, isn't it? Well, let's see. My first thought is, I think it's probably the arrow should go in a different direction. I don't think it works to say I have to find my personal genius and then take action. The arrow goes maybe in the other direction, which is I have to act even though I don't feel like a genius, and then discover my ingenious as I go. I think if jazz musicians waited until they felt ingenious before they played, they would be silent a long time. I think we surprise ourselves when we leap in and act first. And then, of course, you can create conditions that will enhance the possibility that ingenious contributions will unfold. And one of the conditions are this appreciative mindset is if you leap in and act, and then the structure is going to be retrospective. You look back on what happened and to make sense of it. One of the ways you can make sense of it to enhance genius is to pay attention to positive contributions. That's basically what appreciative inquiry tries to do, is to notice activity for its innovative potential rather than for its disappointment. I mean, if we look for disappointment, we'll find it. But if we can highlight positive contributions and positive potential, I think it creates the conditions for more discovery as we move on, and makes it possible to experiment and act as we go, even if we're not feeling brilliant at the time.
Okay. Here's a question. How does yes to the mess work in a digitized business world?
Well, I'm not sure what digitized business world means. It sounds like between numbers. Let's see. I think, I live in Silicon Valley, so that's where the digital revolution is probably felt strongest, or it's felt everywhere, but it's where a lot of it originated. People in Silicon Valley who work in fast-paced organizations like, well, it used to be Cisco was the one everybody talked about, but now it's Google and Apple, Facebook, all the billionaires who are younger than 30. It used to be only millionaires, now they're billionaires. They totally get this. It's not a stretch at all. But I don't think I understand enough about your question to say anything insightful, except to say that I think, the digital revolution and improvisation are first cousins.
Great. Here's a question. I'm wondering how large organizations should practice this and embrace it in a world where risk management is the platform for how the organization works and thinks.
Yeah. Well, it's a puzzle, isn't it? I can tell you what I used to say, and then I'll tell you how I'm amending that. But I think large organizations have to tell a story that is a fiction, but so it drives out improvisation, because they have to tell a story about intention that isn't true. They have to tell a story about planning, as if they had planned and continue to plan for where they are, and they have to set up control mechanisms because it's so large, because they can't touch things. So I work for the U.S. Navy, so it's a command and control organization. It's a regulative environment, and it's more regulatory now than ever before. Rules and regulations are incredibly excessive. And the story people tell about it, especially leaders, is that we have these rules and we have this predictability, and all of that exists. At the same time, there's pockets of improvisation and innovation going on in every organization already. So in the Navy, it's happening all over the place. In the obvious places are with the Navy SEALs and special operations, but even in places you wouldn't expect it, like the submarine force, that's the most command and control, high reliability organization that I can think of. Even there, every organization began as an improvisation, even large ones. General Motors started as an improvisation. Certainly the Navy did. Every innovation started as an improvisation. Now, I used to say that large organizations seek to drive out improvisation by their explicit statements around rules and expectations and predictability, because they need to look reliable and predictable to the rest of the world. That's the face they show. However, I've been interested lately in how even large organizations have become closer to self-managed. So the organization I'm thinking of now is Valve, the game company that creates games. Second Life, for example. It's the largest gaming company in the world, and the revenue per employee, the revenue they generate per employee is higher than Microsoft or Apple. And they have 400 people that work there. But if you were to look closely at how they're organized, they're completely self-managed. There is an owner, but they've deliberately organized with no explicit roles, and people are expected when they come on board to find something to do once they're hired. It's defying in some ways, but it's organized around projects. You're hired and join a project that draws you and make a contribution. And evaluations are done by groups and teams. You get feedback from your colleagues, not from a manager or a supervisor. So, and there's 400 employees there. Now that's not like 40,000 employees or 250,000 employees like the U.S. Navy, but it's pretty big. I wouldn't have thought that 400 people can self-manage, but this organization does. There's others like that as well, but I'm just learning about them, so I'm interested in that.
Great. Thanks, Frank. We have several other questions coming in. We probably have about 6 more questions. I don't know if we'll have time for them, but let's try to see if we can. One person says, what's the difference? What difference do you consider between improvisation and the ability to manage uncertainty?
Well, manage uncertainty sounds like it's controlling. I'm not sure uncertainty can be managed. Can you manage uncertainty? I think I'm not sure. I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah.
Let me think about it. But of course, by the time I get an insight, it'll be an hour from now. So it's not going to help us now, is it? I think so. But I think improvisation means you have a certain stance towards uncertainty. And I don't know that I'd call it manage. The word manage and management came from, originally comes from horses, able to hold the bridle of a horse, the original. So, that's an interesting metaphor, isn't it? The horse can take off and go, and you're trying to hold the bridle tightly and direct it. But it has a mind of its own. So the best become one with the horse. So managers, I think the way they face uncertainty is maybe the question that I would seek to look at. And if you try and drive out uncertainty, if you're trying to eliminate uncertainty, I think you'd be a very careful manager and probably extremely self-defeating.
Let's see. Here's one that maybe you touched upon it with the big organization question, but it's curious to know more about working in the public sector and or healthcare with many bureaucratic rules, regs, compliance issues, where there is much boundedness and those rules and patterns, identities patterns and identities attached to those.
Yeah, that's right. Good. Healthcare, public sector. Again, it's an example where the story we tell to the world and then impose on ourselves is one of predictability, stability, especially high reliability systems, healthcare, nuclear power, all of those things. However, once again, if you look really closely, you'll see there's experimentation and improvisation happening all the time, even though we don't want to look at it, don't want to talk about it. The last thing you want is someone in healthcare who's simply obeying the rules. That's the last thing you want. If they're more devoted to the rules than they are to the patient, you're in trouble. And this goes all the way down to the worker level, right down to the line. I love this study by Amy Edmondson and others that done of nursing units and emergency rooms and operating rooms where one of the ways that they operate is to make sure that they learn by their mistakes. And they're morally obligated at the end of the day to share publicly what mistakes they made so that everybody can learn from it. It doesn't mean that every mistake is tolerated, but it means it's an acknowledgement that humans are trying the best they can in the face of a recalcitrant world that refuses to show up in ways that fit our categories of rules. And so they're learning as they go, in some cases, or trying new things and creating a kind of learning culture. It makes it safe psychologically to create a learning culture. But again, if you look real closely at what's happening, responsible members of all organizations, from physicians and healthcare, from physicians down to janitors in a hospital, they're mending rules and responding in real time. Take a janitor who's mopping the floor. I remember this story. He was cleaning the floor of a hospital room where the patient was in a coma, and his family member was in the room holding his hand, standing with him, and the guy went in and mopped the floor. But the family member didn't notice it and came out and sort of expressed a complaint that the floor hadn't been mopped, even though it already had been done. So the janitor, instead of responding with a rule and saying, no, we did it, went in and just mopped it again. He just, okay. That's an improvisation. He's not following the rules. He's responding to the moment. The last thing you want in a high reliability organization is people who only follow rules.
Yeah, that's great. Great, thanks. I don't know what we want to do here. We've got a couple other questions, and we're nearing the end. If people can stay on longer, or if you want to stay on longer, Frank, we'll take your lead on this.
I have a few more minutes. And you were starting to break up a little bit, which maybe the universe is telling us something. But go ahead, let's take one or two more.
There's one here about that you speak about the powerful forces of shame and fear in locking people into structure and presumed predictability. How do you help groups overcome that fear and shame factor to unleash the improv and the possibilities?
Well, I think that's a great question. It's, in some systems, it's not so easy. I think there's a couple things. One is the simple act of brainstorming. I know IDEO, the organization IDEO, I'm having some reception trouble. Can you still hear me, Dawn?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. Design thinking has taken on some popularity lately, and especially the organization IDEO and others like it, to use brainstorming, where you say, okay, you create a timeout and say, this is a time to contribute all wild ideas and even the silliest ones, and make it okay for even silly things to be contributed. I think one of the things you could do is deliberately look foolish. Start off by deliberately looking foolish for a minute and showing everybody you survived, and then keep going. I think the effort has to be not on evaluating what happened in the past, but because when you evaluate what happens in the past, it triggers a shame orientation. But to sort of pull for ongoing effort to try again and try again and try again. That's what Miles Davis did, and he used to deliberately set up these little experiments where he made his musicians try something they'd never done before, even though they were afraid they were going to look like idiots. So he would change the key on the spot, which meant that they didn't know the song in that key. They'd be stepping all over themselves, but there's no choice but to keep trying and try again and try again. It shifts your focus to what is next, rather than, oh my God, what did I do? Oh my God, I can't believe I did that. You can't have both mindsets at the same time. You can't have both orientations at the same time. So if you think next, that helps to drive out shame.
Right.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Frank.
Thank you, Bob.
Do you want to go to the piano for a couple minutes before we log off?
Well, what, you don't want to see me dance? What do you want me to do?
Just an invite, just a few minutes. And while Frank's getting over to the piano, let me just pull up a quick slide here about our master's program. We have a
I'll do background music while I'm doing this. This would be sort of like think of it like cocktail lounge music for the master's program.
We have a new master's program, and Frank's one of the guest faculty in it, and it is on relational leading. And I know Frank started his talk today by talking about leadership not as an individual, but as a coordinated action. So, and it's in this coordinated action of relational leading that we focus on in this program. We invite all of you to go to that website and take a look at the program. Share it with people that you know who may be interested in a master's program. But the exciting thing is we've also added a certificate program to the same offering, so you can participate as part of the cohort and be in the master's program or in the certificate program at the same time. So take a look at that link. And Frank, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Sorry, is this the music too?
No, we're good. We are totally good.
By the way, I was just playing Smoke Gets in Your Eyes because Mary Gergen always asked me for that song. So that's a special request for her. Okay, thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here.